pleasure to welcome George, who I actually met for the first time just a couple of days ago. He's been in Nottingham for a couple of days. He's here actually with Lisa Rossman, who was here, some of you might remember, last year. Good to turn this into an annual or maybe biannual event in terms of time series analysis in music. So George has just got his PhD last week.
Correct.
Yeah. He did his first degree and his master's in Athens, then moved to Max Planck Institute in Nottingham, as you can see, and actually from January he's shifting field entirely to start another postdoc position actually in the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg on climate change, meteorology,
stuff like
weather
that.
dynamics, that type of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But as you can see, he's should also mention that George is also an extremely good drummer, has got a degree in music, and is also fascinated by, as you can see, time series in music and different dynamics and fluctuations in music. Over to you, George. I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for joining my talk. So as Philip mentioned, I'm actually a physicist. I work in nonlinear dynamics, but I'm also a drummer, which is where these things come from. So what I will be doing today is presenting the work that we do in the group of Theo Geisel in the Max Planck Institute for Dynamics and Self-Organization. And what we do there is we analyze music time series. But before going into the main part of the talk, I want to start with an excerpt of one of my favorite performances of all time that goes like this. So what I wanted to demonstrate with this clip is that music, as a phenomenon, is both complex as well as complicated. And this is because you have so many factors happening at the same time. For example, you have the interaction between the musicians. You have the complicated notes that they have to actually perform. You have timing, harmony, movement, and you also have improvisation. So a lot of what you just heard happened on the fly. It was not predetermined. So this makes it something extremely difficult to conceptualize. But what if I told you that if you indeed tried to analyze music, you would find that it has some universal properties? And this is exactly what I will start with the first part of my talk. So of course, when we are talking about time series of music, we have to be more specific because even the most fundamental music information is multidimensional. Because you have time, the time aspect, when to play a note, you have the pitch aspect, which is which notes to play, and you have the intensity aspect, which is how strongly to play a note. So for starters, I will reduce complexity by focusing on one of these dimensions, which will be time. So when I'm saying music time series, I am actually referring to time series of what we call micro-timing deviations. So what is this? Imagine that you have a metronome playing, and the metronome is a machine. So a machine plays its perfect intervals in time without any error. And now a human is listening to this machine play, and they are trying to follow along. But it is natural that the human played note will deviate from the perfect metronome click. And these deviations is what we call micro-timing deviations. Now, if you take these deviations and put them in order, you have a time series, which is the time series of the micro-timing deviations. So this is what I will analyze in the following. So the first analysis of this kind of time series happened in the group of Theo Geisel by Holger Henning and other people, of course. And what they did is analyze this extremely simple micro-timing deviation time series where you have a musician that is trying to play the same click track as a metronome. And this is how the analysis happened. So they recorded people playing music, and then they extracted the time series, and then they did some kind of analysis on them that I will go in detail in the next slide. But the important thing here, and the novel thing as well, was that they consistently found power law structures in this analysis. Now let's talk about what these power law structures mean. And of course, in this work over here, the authors also proposed that these power law structures are what makes human music pleasant for humans. We'll see about this. So, what are these power law things? If you have a time series, then you can say that this time series is power law correlated if one of the following two things happen. The first thing is that you look at the spectral density of your time series, and you find that the spectral density is a power law. The second approach, which is getting more and more popularity, is to use what is called the trended fluctuation analysis. If this analysis is also a power law, then you can also say that your time series is power law correlated. But why is this important? Well, because if you have a power law in this spectral density, or the DFA, then it is known analytically that your autocorrelation function is also a power law. And this slow power law decay is often associated with what people call long-range correlations, which then is taken a step further and is associated with long-range interactions or long-range memory in the system under study. I will talk about this later as well. But moving forwards, the next step in this study was in 2015 by actually ESA, which is right here today, and again Holger Henning and other people, of course, where they moved away from these simple, almost trivial recordings when a person is trying to follow a standard click and analyzed real music. In fact, they found the same kind of power law structures in the hi-hat recording, so this is the hi-hat that drummers use, of a pop song, of a single pop song. And now we wanted to take this one more step further, because up to this point in time we have laboratory studies where you have this kind of trivial micro-timing deviation time series that only follow a click track, and you have a single piece. And at least in my eyes, this is not enough to claim whether these kind of power law structures are indeed a universal feature of music. So to confirm or disprove this claim, we analyzed 100 original music recordings from both rock and jazz styles of music. And this is how the analysis progressed. We first had the music album that we got from Spotify. From the music albums, we extracted appropriate raw audio tracks, and then we did a series of digital signal processing techniques to extract the time series of this instrument, which is called the ride cymbal. And this is an instrument the drummers use to convey time information to the rest of the band. And after we had this time series, we had a further analysis step that tried to detect exactly at which point in time the drummer is playing. And I started this talk by defining the so-called micro-timing deviations time series, but here there is a problem. We cannot really use them because we don't really know whether there is a metronome in the recordings that we have, and even if there is one, we have no access to it because we just got the tracks from Spotify. So instead, we have to look at something different, which is called inter-beat-intervals. Since we have no metronome, we say, okay, let's look at the bit that we have at this point in time and simply measure the distance of the bit we had in the previous point in time, this one. So this IBI, inter-beat intervals, is the time series that will show the analysis in the next couple of slides. And long story made short is that we find the same kind of power law structures in the spectral densities of these inter-beat intervals, which is what you see here. And there was also an interesting, let's say, side finding, so to speak, that if your recording had a metronome, then you would find a single power law in your power spectrum, this one. However, if your recording had no metronome, then you would have, what happened? Then you would have two power laws in your recording. The first is the same power law as with the with metronome version, but now there is also a second power law that contributes to the spectrum, which comes from a different contribution. And it turns out that these two power laws actually come from the two different processes that go on in your, let's say, while you're playing music. The first process is the brain process. Your brain is trying to estimate when the next beat should be played. The second process is actually your arms, your motors that execute the command of the brain. And both of these processes have some kind of stochastic component, so they are not completely perfect, but they have some randomness. And this is where these two exponents come from. I will not go into further detail into this problem because it is summarized in this publication. All right. So what I'm showing here is actually the values of these two exponents I just described for 100 different recordings. And I don't know if you can see it very well, but there are two dashed green lines here. Now, the green lines show the uncorrelated case, the case where there is no power law structure. And what you should notice is that there is a consistently significant difference between the actual exponents we measure in the recordings and the uncorrelated case. So in my eyes, this plot does indeed confirm that these power law structures are a universal property of music, since all of these recordings also come from different drummers. We didn't analyze a single person. But we can take it further. Since we have analyzed both rock and jazz, one can now wonder whether there is a gender dependence of this kind of power laws and long-range correlations across the different genres. And what happens is that the first exponent that is somehow related with the brain process is actually the same between the different styles. But the second exponent, which is related with the motor process, so to speak, is different. And in fact, what happens is that the exponent for jazz is a bit larger. You can somehow interpret this as saying that the jazz drummers have stronger microtiming deviations, whatever stronger means. But of course, this is nothing new. This is something that every drummer in the world knows already intuitively. The new part is quantifying this scientifically. Okay, and now it's time to really ask the serious question, what does this long range actually mean? As I said in the introduction part, this power law structure, which I think I have already established that is a universal feature of music, is often associated with long-range correlation or long-term memory in a process. Now, I personally have a big problem here because a drummer doesn't really remember his or her timings from 10 seconds ago, much more so from 5 minutes ago. So what does this long range actually mean? What I think happens is that there are some other explanations which I find much more feasible. For example, one explanation was provided in 2014 by Holger Henning that showed that these kind of long-range correlations will always arise because of the adaptivity to the previous beat interval that you had. So if your previous beat interval was very large, then you try to adapt to make it smaller. And in fact, it is well known that this kind of feedback mechanism results in power law structures. Another explanation came out recently, in fact this year, and this group showed that it is possible to have these long-range correlations as a side effect of having several short-range correlations in your system, each with a different time lag or a time delay. So this is what I think is more reasonable. But okay, we know the sequence of these microtiming deviations is, let's say, a power law correlated. What happens to the distribution of these numbers? And what turns out to be the case is that the magnitude of these microtiming deviations, or inter-beat intervals, is in fact normal. And this is true for every recording we have ever seen. So let's say for a piano recording, or for a drum recording with or without metronome, or for a conga recording, or pretty much anything, the distribution of these microtiming deviations is always a Gaussian. Okay, but what about other fundamental properties of music? Timing is one thing, but what about the pitch? And I remind you that pitch means which note you play. And of course, here I'm showing completely preliminary results. But you can estimate pitch with two ways. First, by looking at raw audio recordings, and the other thing is by looking at transcriptions. So you have a page that tells you which note to play at which point in time. And when you look at these things, for example, classical music, you still find the power law in your spectral density for the pitch now. And you still find the power law even for improvisation in jazz music, again for the spectral density. So these power laws really seem to be everywhere. And now the final question is what happens about the intensity? Now in the intensity, the thing is a bit trickier because if you have this kind of trivial time series where you are simply trying to follow a metronome and do nothing else, and if you also say to the drummer that he should try to keep a constant intensity, then you again find power law in the spectrum for the intensity. This is not what we find when we look at real music, though. When we look at real music, there is no power law to be seen whatsoever, but I think this makes sense because in real music, there is no such thing as a feedback mechanism. How strongly you will play a note at this point in time does not really depend that much on what happened before, but it does depend on where you are in a music bar. Because if you imagine playing a hard rock beat, then you know that you have to accent specific parts of your let's say, of your performance, and it doesn't matter what happened before or not. So, and once again, I point out these are all preliminary results. Now, since we know that for this kind of trivial tapping-like recordings where you just follow a metronome, both the time information as well as the intensity information are power law correlated, one could ask whether they are also correlated with each other. And surprisingly, this is not what we find. We do not find any correlation between the intensity and the timing, the microtiming deviation. And this you can also see just from a random scatter plot and the Pearson correlation, but you can also see it with more advanced techniques like DCCA that I don't really want to go into any detail. Okay, so that was the first part of this talk. And the second part tries to address, let's say, a more real question in the sense, what happens with the actual music? What happens with us humans listening music and these micro-timing deviations? So the stage so far is that in the literature, there is a big debate about how important these micro-timing deviations actually are. Because you know that they have this special power law structure, and you know that the computer will not be able to generate this power law structure because the computer is perfect. So many musicologists have been claiming that these micro-timing deviations is what makes human music special. The problem is that empirical research so far has failed to find evidence for this claim. And what we wanted to do is try to answer this question or this debate conclusively. So the first thing we realized is that we should turn into jazz music because, first of all, by the very definition of jazz music, there is much less strictness on the actual timing that you have to play. And also I have already shown evidence that jazz drumming has stronger, so to speak, micro-timing deviations. So this is a simple project that we came up with in order to answer this question, to answer what is the impact of micro-timing deviations. This idea goes as follows. First, we get a professional pianist into our institute and we record him playing jazz standards. For example, Blue Monk, So What, Now's the Time, and similar. And keep in mind that these jazz standards were recorded with a backing track, so effectively the recording was with a metronome. So this was one of the recorded tracks, and this is a second sample. So what I want to point out is that this is real music. There is nothing fishy, there is nothing just try to follow a metronome. The guy is playing real music. Then what we did is we took his recordings and manipulated them in several different ways to either remove or alter these micro-timing deviations. And then the final step was to collaborate with the psychology department of the University of Nottingham and ask jazz professional players what they think is best. So let me talk a bit about manipulating these micro-timing deviations. Let's say that you have this original recording over here. This is the metronome, the time where the metronome plays. And of course, the notes naturally deviate from the metronome. Every note has a micro-timing deviation, di. So the first thing we did was to exaggerate the performance in the sense that for every timing deviation, we made it larger. So we multiplied every micro-timing deviation with a factor of 2. Another thing you can do is quantization. Quantization means to completely remove all timing deviations or to multiply them by 0. And by the way, this is a process well known in the music industry that is done routinely on recordings. And then a final thing we do was to invert the timing deviation. So if you were playing ahead of the beat, then you would play behind the beat. This is for every note, of course. All right. But now there is a problem here because this nice picture that I show here cannot be directly applied into our recordings because the pianist is playing real music. He's not playing just quarter notes with a metronome. There are notes played in between the quarter notes, and we of course have to take care of these notes. Yes. So this is how we do this. We know that he's playing jazz music, and jazz music operates in triplets. This means that every metronome click is divided into 3 equal notes. And in jazz, you only play the first of these 3 notes and the third one, but not the second. So what we say is, okay, what we should do is we should try to classify every played note according to either if it is the first part of this triplet, which we call bass note, or if it is the third part of this triplet, which we call swing notes. So we did this classification, and then for each of these 2 categories, we computed the average position. Where should this be? And then it is straightforward because you then define the micro-timing deviations as the distance from the average position, not just the metronome click. And this is important because this scheme is not really jazz dependent. This is a robust scheme that allows you to consistently define microtiming deviations for any music style. We just applied this to jazz. So this is really how the manipulation actually looked. Okay. Now after we have these manipulations, we go and do this online survey with the psychology department that works as follows. The first part of the survey is a small questionnaire about your music expertise. And this allowed us to classify people according to their skill level. And the second part is the core part of the survey, where people were listening to 12 different recordings, 3 from each different manipulation for, let's say, 60 seconds, like so. So this had to go for 60 seconds. And then they answered these questions. The first 2 questions are some kind of control questions. And the last question is what we care about. So we need a way to quantify the pleasantness of a piece, of a recording, and in jazz music, what you use is the term swing. So if a musician says, this is swinging, this is a way for the musician to claim that this piece is pleasant for themselves. So we did not impose a definition of pleasantness on the musicians, they chose themselves. And a rating of 4, that is over here, means that it's very much swinging or very much pleasant, while a rating of 1 is that it is not at all. And of course, we also had a big data set in this survey of around 160 people. Okay, now before I show the results, what could happen? Let's try to think what could happen in this survey. The first thing that could happen is that, let's say that I have here some kind of measure of swinginess in the y-axis, and the x-axis are the different manipulations. So the standing hypothesis from the musicologist is that the original version has the perfect amount of intended microtiming deviations because it's played by a professional. And therefore, these microtiming deviations are necessary for swing, and this version should be the most swinging, so to speak. However, empirical evidence side more with hypothesis number 2 that says that, okay, microtiming deviations can be bad if they are too large, which is normal, but they are otherwise unaffecting because they are in the same level as the auditory threshold. And there is the third hypothesis that says microtiming deviations are always distracting because they are just a reflection of the human error and they are never intended. And therefore, the quantized version should always be preferred. So this is the result of the survey. That is the average, or not the average, it is the average proportion of ratings that is average over all pieces, all recordings we had, and over 160 participants. So the y-axis is simply the proportion of ratings, and the x-axis are the different manipulations. So let's say here you can see that around, how much is this? Let's say 35% of the people rated the quantized version with 4, while 30% rated the original version with 4. So if I bring back my hypothesis kind of plot, what you see is that in fact the green hypothesis is the one that fits the data best. And let's delve a bit deeper into this survey because this is of course an aggregate result. So what I'm showing here is first of all 4 subplots. Each subplot represents one group of expertise. Okay? Now in the subplots, the y-axis is again the percentage of people that gave this rating, while the x-axis is the rating itself. And the 4 different colors are the 4 different versions, red being quantized, green original, etc. So the first thing that you see from this plot is that the quantized version is in fact preferred consistently over the original. And this you see by looking at the red curve and seeing that the red curve always has more weight on the right side of the plot when compared with, for example, the green curve. Another result is that the professionals rated worse overall every version, and this you can see, which is of course expected, and this you can see because in this plot all curves have more weight on the left side. Now something that was not expected is that the inverted version had in fact very similar ratings with the original version, because if you look at the green curves and the orange curves, they are actually very close to each other in all 4 subplots. And even though it was initially unexpected, we actually were able to answer why this happens. And the last part that you see from this plot is that the exaggerated version always rated worse, which is of course completely expected. So let me summarize what has happened so far. The first part of this talk was about the, in my eyes, universal structure that exists in music time series. The most notable of these structures being that the sequence of the timing deviations of a human performance is in fact power law correlated. Whether this means something or not, of course, is for the individual to decide. What we were able to show, though, is that in a survey that inquired about the impact of microtiming deviations in jazz music, people preferred the quantized versions. The important thing is that this survey had a big amount of participants, people that rated, and it also had a big sample pool of 48 different music samples. And importantly, our manipulation procedures had something systematic and reproducible. And as I said, the main outcome of this survey was to show that indeed these microtiming deviations have in fact a negative impact on the swing feeling, because people prefer versions without these timing deviations. What I didn't say during my talk is that the survey results are very well robust, because they don't really depend on the size of our set. Everything that I've showed is very well within confidence intervals. What I want to stress now is that this result does not, in fact, mean that computers are better at playing music. Not at all. What you have to understand is that this survey was extremely specific. What notes to play, what harmony to follow, how to phrase the recordings, how strongly to play, whether to use sustain pedal. These are all choices that the pianist had free will on, and we did not change them in any way. The only thing we did is change these tiny, minute deviations to not exist at all, or be different. And there is another thing that I want to say. So this survey was indeed for jazz music, but I think that this result should apply to all styles of music. Because as I said, jazz music has by far the most freedom regarding time. And if you don't want these timing deviations even in jazz music, I would imagine that you don't want them even more in rock. Okay, so as a quick outlook, I want to show what I'm currently working on. And I'm working on how musicians synchronize with each other. So as I said, I'm a professional drummer and I play with several people several times per week. And an insight I have from my own experience, but also by talking with other musicians, is the following. That when you practice music, you want to have a metronome to guide you and to be sure that you keep a constant tempo. But when you play with other musicians in a live setting or even in a studio setting, most of the time you do not want a metronome, because you feel like you synchronize better with each other without a metronome. Now, this is weird for me because, and in fact the entire situation is weird because, as I have shown, the time series of the timings of musicians have stochastic components. Yet, even though there are stochastic components, two musicians can play together and synchronize in what I call super tight, which of course means perfect synchrony, even though they have this stochastic component. Now, this is weird as for a scientist, because you would say that, well, if you both have a stochastic component, you should synchronize better where there is a metronome, because the metronome has no stochastic component. So you should just follow the metronome and it should be easier. But this is not what happens in reality. It is the other way around. You synchronize better without a metronome. So the first part of my project will be to confirm or even disprove this statement that musicians synchronize better with each other without a metronome. And the second part of the project will be to understand why this happens by using a stochastic model that both has a, let's say, the metronome part would be a constant driving force and no metronome part. And I want to close with this nice plot over here, where this is simply a recording of me playing the drums and the keyboard player of my band playing the keyboard, and we're playing Heard It Through the Grapevine. And these are the time series of our microtiming deviations. Mine are with blue, his are with orange. And I find it completely amazing that it's clear that these are stochastic time series. No one would tell me that this is deterministic, and I would say, sure thing, sure thing. They are clearly stochastic, and you can clearly see that we go up and down together, not only in the large scale, but also in the smaller scales as well. So with this, I want to thank, of course, all the people that have participated in these various projects that I've shown, part of the Geisel group. This is Theo Geisel, by the way. And of course, thank you all for your attention. By the way, if you want my slides, just send me an email and I will send you the slides. Thank you.